I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again with another video edition of the best movie you never saw, and this week we're taking a look at the movie Alienation, which takes place in the future year of 1991. Now, in this alternate version of quote-unquote the future, 3 years ago enslaved aliens escaped from their homeworld, landing in the Mojave Desert. Given refuge by the US government, the aliens, dubbed newcomers, have been fully integrated into the city of Los Angeles, and one of them, George Francisco, played by Mandy Patinkin, is the first of his kind to be made a detective and is partnered with a human cop, Sykes, played by James Caan, who's a bigoted veteran with an axe to grind against the newcomers as one of them murdered his former partner, who of course was pretty close to retirement. Together, they attempt to track down the manufacturers of a designer drug designed to re-enslave the newcomers. In addition to James Caan and Mandy Patinkin, this movie also stars Terrence Stamp, and it was directed by Graham Baker, who you may know from having directed Omen 3. Now, this movie is well remembered by fans, at least those that have seen it, and it did spawn a pretty popular Fox TV show. However, not everybody seems to be a fan of this movie, and unfortunately, one of the people that seems to hate this movie is actor James Caan, who, in his Random Roles AV Club interview, had this to say when they asked him about it. Why the fuck? Why would you bring up that? Now, I don't really get why James Caan hates this movie so much. Granted though, it was a troubled production. In the late 80s, the buddy cop formula reigned supreme, and it arguably started with 48 Hours, but the movie that really kicked into overdrive was Lethal Weapon, and by 1998, you had all kinds of mismatched buddy cops hitting the screen. You had goofy buddy cops such as Pat Morita and Jay Leno in Collision Course, which was so bad it sat unreleased for 4 years until 1992. Dead buddy cops, such as in Dead Heat, which is Joe Piscopo and Treat Williams as zombie cops.
Sorry to interrupt your erection, pal, but we'd like to speak with the management.
And a year later, another mini-genre unto itself was formed, the human dog buddy cop movie, including Turner and Hooch and K9. So, I mean, why not have alien buddy cops, right? The reasoning was sound, and with Gale Anne Hurd behind it, Alienation was a can't-miss formula. Add to that James Caan, who was making a comeback at the time. Now, the thing about James Caan, if you look at his filmography, he did Thief in 1981, and he also directed a movie the same year called Hide in Plain Sight. But after that, he was kind of off the map for a good 6 years. Now, apparently, the issue was that James Caan had a little bit of a drug problem at the time and had to take some time off to get things straightened out. But anyway, by this point in his career, he was clean and sober and ready to work, and he started to make a comeback, although unfortunately he had lost a little bit of momentum at the time, and also he had clearly aged in the intervening years. However, I think this actually kind of helped his career in a way, and Alienation is one of the better movies that he did from that era before his comeback really kicked into high gear with 1990's Misery.
It's for the best.
Eddie, please!
Almost done.
Now, James Caan played our human lead, but our alien lead in this was none other than Mandy Patinkin. Now, you wouldn't think of Mandy Patinkin as being an action star, but at the time he was coming off of The Princess Bride, and if you watch The Princess Bride where he played Inigo Montoya, he was kind of a badass in that movie, right?
I want my father back, you son of a bitch.
Now, why not cast him as half of a buddy cop film? So, Mandy Patinkin and James Caan put together, and you have a film that probably could have spawned at least 2 sequels. Sadly, things behind the scenes did not go well, with Caan later on saying really shitty things about director Graham Baker, who, to be fair to Caan, was maybe too much of a journeyman to tackle what should have been a major action franchise for Fox. In fact, one of the problems with this movie is that it was clearly done on a low budget, probably too low a budget for a big sci-fi action comedy. In the end, the film went through a pretty drastic round of re-editing that disastrously led to an excellent score by Jerry Goldsmith being dropped in favor of a low-key score by Kurt Sobel. Still, the film wound up getting fairly decent notices, and the domestic gross stalled at about $25 million, which wasn't a horrible number for 1987, but also wasn't enough of a number to make them want to do any sequels. Now, when people think of Alienation these days, if they think of it at all, I'm sure they're thinking of the Fox TV show. which ran for about a year and had some TV movies afterwards. And fair enough, the TV spin-off was kind of groundbreaking in its day. Having the newcomer males carry the children and stuff like that was a pretty daring move. But the 1988 film it's based on actually deserves a second look. While it has its problem, noticeably a lack of well-staged action scenes that may stem from a TV movie-like approach by the director, it's distinguished by an unusually clever script. To my way of thinking, good sci-fi should always hold up a mirror to society.
Why do we have to take them? Why can't they go to Russia or someplace like that?
And Alienation smartly addresses racism and police violence with its tale of a racist, only against aliens though, cop being paired up with a newcomer partner and being forced to find common ground with him.
Town, I hate this place. Look at that geek.
Now granted, Caan's character is never built up to be particularly loathsome, just ignorant. Rockne S. O'Bannon's script spends more time than usual trying to humanize its hero, with him shown to be a divorced dad with an emotional side who saves the tapes whenever his daughter calls to say I love you on his answering machine.
I love you, Daddy.
The gut punch of his partner dying early in the film hits closer to home than usual for the genre thanks to Caan's vulnerability in the part. You really get the sense that he's devastated that his best friend has gotten killed. By the same token though, his edge is sharp enough to make his transition to a more tolerant cop feel earned, and in the action scenes you really do feel like James Caan has the potential to fuck someone up. Likewise, Mandy Patinkin, coming off The Princess Bride, does a lot to humanize his newcomer character, George Francisco. Now, one of the big problems behind the scenes, apparently, was that the original name for George Francisco was actually George Jetson. Now, if you watch the movie, basically what's happened is all of these newcomer characters have been giving names of fictional characters as some kind of weird joke that society is playing on them, I guess. It's never really explained. But in the entire movie, apparently his name was George Jetson, and one of the things that Mandy Patinkin really liked about the movie was that you had a hardcore action movie with the lead named George Jetson, and he played the movie as if he was playing George Jetson. Now, I know it's probably not a big deal if they changed the name to Francisco in post-production, and you can actually see him mouthing the words Jetson and Francisco is dubbed in, but Mandy Patinkin had a real problem with this because he was playing George Jetson and not George Francisco. As he said in an interview in Starlog at the time, I thought it made a tremendous difference to the piece that the guy's name was George Jetson because it gave it a cartoon feeling, an innocence that was important to the movie's whole idea. It's a great loss to the piece that we couldn't recover and a great misfortune that couldn't be solved. It would have helped a lot. Everything in the script is Jetson, everything in the makeup is labeled Jetson, and we always refer to him as Jetson. Not even George, but Jetson. So in our minds, he's George Jetson. So as far as I'm concerned, anybody who sees the movie, they're watching George Jetson, no matter what the hell they call him. George Jetson aside, Mandy Patinkin is still quite low-key and emotional in this film. Really not what you'd expect from a buddy cop action movie from that era. And the bonding scenes with him and Caan really work. You got two guys who are really good actors working opposite each other, and sparks really do fly here. O'Bannon's script is also quite witty for the era, with a great joke about being how the newcomers can only get drunk off of sour milk.
Take a hike, will you? Jesus Christ. God, that stink. Why's it gotta be sour milk they get wasted on? Why can't it be like Jack Daniels or Thunderbird, for Christ's sakes? What's wrong with that?
I also like the conceit that salt water is like acid for them. The drug running storyline, however, is pretty familiar for the genre, especially being in the era of Just Say No, but overall it's a quick, effective comedy thriller with some genuine staying power. Now, one of my favorite scenes in any action movie from the 80s is that there's always a scene where the badass cop gets a fancy new gun and tries it out. RoboCop has the granddaddy of all these scenes. Sudden Impact also has a really famous one. And in this one, James Caan gets a big old gun that he's going to use against some aliens, and he tries out at target practice. I always enjoy scenes like these in 80s movies. Now, Alienation is pretty easy to find. It's available on DVD, on Blu-ray, and in HD on iTunes, and you can probably get it for under $10. Now, while Alienation probably isn't as good as it should have been, it stands up, I think, as a fun addition to the 80s buddy cop pantheon, and it's far superior to the recent Bright, which must have been more than a little inspired by the premise. Now, Jeff Nichols has talked in recent years about potentially remaking Alienation, although it seems that the project is stalled. If Jeff Nichols does manage to get off the ground again, I have to say Michael Shannon would make a great newcomer, wouldn't he?
Punch yourself in the face right now so that I don't have to fucking find you on campus and do it myself.
I mean, just think of him bald with the marks on his head. I think it'd be great. Until next time, everyone, I'm Chris Bunbury for JoBlo.com.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
The 1980s were the heyday of Caan films. Run by Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, these Israeli cousins took Hollywood for a ride that was so epic it was chronicled not one but two documentaries: Electric Boogaloo, the wild untold story of Caan films, unauthorized and good, and The Go-Go Boys, authorized and bad. While they would eventually lose a ton of money and go belly up thanks to their choice to compete with the Hollywood majors with big budget flops like Life Force, Over the Top, and Masters of the Universe, in the early 80s, Golan and Globus had the formula for a moneymaker down cold. Simply put, action movies were their specialty. They had a huge hit in 1981 with the schlocky Enter the Ninja, which featured an oddly cast and dubbed Franco Nero as a heroic white ninja. The film was a blockbuster, but truth be told, no one walked out of the movie talking about the white guy, Franco Nero, who was doubled for most of the action. The guy who played the adversary, Sho Kosugi, the evil ninja, was the one everyone remembered. Thus, the decision was made to give the film a sequel, but instead of playing the baddie, Kosugi would play the heroic lead. In it, he plays a modern ninja master whose family is slaughtered in Japan by evil ninjas. He kills the shit out of all of them, but then hangs up his sword, moving to the US to open an art gallery with his mom and his surviving son Caan in tow. Little does he know, his gallery is being used as a front to smuggle drugs by an evil ninja. And, as his character says, only a ninja can defeat a ninja, leading to a spectacular battle royale atop of a skyscraper in Salt Lake City. For many, Revenge of the Ninja ranks as one of the best action movies Caan ever made. They made a couple of smart choices with this one, and one was promoting Kosugi to the lead. He was able to do things on camera Western audiences had simply never seen before, and he was the first true crossover martial arts star since Bruce Lee, predating the late 90s American breakthroughs of Jet Li and Jackie Chan. So of course, in Asia, there were amazing martial arts movies being made, and truth be told, martial arts movies that are a lot better than anything Caan put out. But for Western audiences, this was some pretty heavy stuff. Kosugi also choreographed the fights and doubled some of his own adversaries using a little movie magic. Another big martial artist of the time, Keith Vitale, who would later become a B-movie star in his own right, plays his police officer pal who tries to take on the ninjas single-handedly, but loses pretty badly. This is all Kosugi's show, with his actual son Caan playing his kid in the movie. This would become a recurring thing in Sho Kosugi movies, as Caan and his brother Shane would often show up in their dad's movies as his wisecracking Americanized sons. Caan would become a stuntman and star in his own right as an adult, and he's pretty cute as Sho's kid here, getting a lot of fun action scenes and being caught on camera a couple of times staring at co-star Ashley Farrar's impressive cleavage. I mean, who can blame him? The fights are all pretty creative, which brings me to the second smart thing Golan and Globus did: hire Sam Furstenberg to direct. Golan himself did Enter the Ninja, but Furstenberg was a lot more creative, proving to be an excellent creative partner with Kosugi. He keeps the movie running at a wicked pace, helped along by the dope synth score, and indeed he would prove to be one of Caan's most valuable directors in the 80s. He would helm the legendary sequel, Ninja 3: The Domination, which was already well covered here in Awfully Good by Jesse Shade, as well as the movie that launched Michael Dudikoff as a big deal action star in the mid-80s, American Ninja. He would even direct Breaking 2: Electric Boogaloo. The guy had range. If Caan had a failing though, it's that they never invested the money where they belonged. They would spend something like $30 million on Life Force, a film no one watched, while Furstenberg movies like Avenging Force and American Ninja 2 would be made on a shoestring. If they had doubled down and given him a significant amount of money to play with, along with stars like Dudikoff and Kosugi, who always seemed on the cusp of bigger and better things, he might have made an epic. But alas, they didn't, and the company went belly up. And sadly, Furstenberg and Dudikoff and Kosugi sometimes are not really mentioned when people talk about great 80s action icons. Now, Revenge of the Ninja was a big hit at the box office, grossing $13 million. Now, this may not sound like a lot of money, but given that it was an indie film and cheap, in 1983 this was considered big bucks. It was an even bigger hit on VHS, becoming a staple of 80s birthday parties everywhere despite the hardcore R rating. Kosugi would eventually leave Caan Films due to a dispute with what else but money to make his own B-Ninja movies like 9 Deaths of the Ninja and Pray for Death, a genre that unfortunately would peter out pretty quickly, although his Black Eagle would prove to be one of Jean-Claude Van Damme's first movies. He made a comeback in the Wachowskis' Ninja Assassin years later. So Revenge of the Ninja is not a perfect movie, but man, is it a fun film. And if you like this, you gotta dig into the Caan catalog. I realize that a lot of younger viewers may not know who Caan Films are, but I have to say they made some really cool flicks. There's a lot of good ninja movies, there's some really cool Chuck Norris movies, there's even a couple of Charles Bronson movies that, while not great, aren't that bad and are very reminiscent of the kind of movies that Liam Neeson makes nowadays. In fact, one might say that Charles Bronson was the Liam Neeson of the 80s. In fact, if you're looking for a couple of solid Caan film recommendations, here's a little Caan Films lightning round. So, in terms of Sho Kosugi movies, Enter the Ninja, not bad, although unfortunately he's sidelined by Franco Nero. There is a really cool fight scene at the end, and a game that I like to play with this movie is look at the ninja's eyes. Franco Nero has these really expressive blue eyes, and you can tell whenever he's doubled because his double, Mike Stone, has brown eyes, and it's very obvious in the film when Franco Nero isn't actually fighting, which is pretty much any time he has the ninja outfit on. Revenge of the Ninja is great. Ninja 3 is also amazing. It's a little disappointing that Sho Kosugi is relegated to kind of the sidekick role, but I had a lot of fun with it when I watched it a few months ago, and it really is a blast. Furstenberg gets this thing going. American Ninja with Michael Dudikoff. I could see why it made him a star. He was kind of a karate-kicking version of James Dean, and very different from guys like Chuck Norris. Again, I think Michael Dudikoff, had he had bigger budgets, probably would have gone on to become a major action star, similar to someone like Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal, but it just didn't work out for him. Even still, American Ninja is a lot of fun, as is American Ninja 2, but probably his best overall action movie is Avenging Force, which is actually a quasi-sequel to a Chuck Norris Caan movie, Invasion USA. Which brings us to another Caan movie stalwart, Chuck Norris. Now, if you want to watch good Chuck Norris movies, actually you kind of have to go outside of Caan, because all the best movies he made were for other studios, because they had more money. Code of Silence is arguably his best film, although a lot of people also like Lone Wolf McQuade. For Caan Films, he did do the Missing in Action series, which Real Action host Travis Hobson is a huge fan of. For my money, the first Missing in Action is the only good movie in the series. The sequels are pretty unwatchable, although I do really like Chuck Norris's Invasion USA, which is just completely insane. It's like a serial killer movie with him as the serial killer, but he's a good guy. He's like Jason in it. The heroes are just terrified of him. One of the villains actually has nightmares that Chuck Norris is coming to kill him. And guess what? At the end, Chuck Norris comes to kill him. I also like the first Delta Force, but man, it takes forever for this thing to go. It's something like 2.5 hours long, and the Delta Force doesn't even start kicking ass until about an hour and a half into the movie. I mean, come on, guys. It seems like they were trying to make a disaster movie, like an airport or something like that, but it just doesn't really work. Delta Force 2 is okay, but cheap. Now, the other big action icon of Caan Films was Charles Bronson, and he's also a very mixed bag. The movies that he made outside of Caan Films are all pretty good, but when he went to Caan, the movies just became kind of schlocky. In fact, the only movie of his that I say that really holds up is probably Death Wish 3 by Michael Winner, which is just completely insane. I mean, if you watch it, it's like a fever dream. He kills something like over 100 bad guys in this film, and it's just complete insanity. And it's not as mean-spirited as the rest of the movies in the Death Wish series. Death Wish 2, in particular, is a pretty repugnant film. In Death Wish 4, by that point, Charles Bronson had gotten sick of Michael Winner, so it has J. Lee Thompson, who directed a lot of these movies, helming it, but besides the showdown at the end, there's not a lot of action. For Charles Bronson, I guess the only one that people seem to remember fondly is a movie he did called 10 to Midnight, which is like a slasher film, but also kind of skeezy and kind of sketch. Murphy's Law has its moments, but I don't know, the Charles Bronson movies just don't really hold up as well, and some of them are pretty unwatchable, like Assassination. Of course, the biggest star to emerge from Caan films was Jean-Claude Van Damme, but he actually only ever really made 2 movies for Caan, Bloodsport and Cyborg. By the time Cyborg came out, he had flown the coop as the studio had gone under. And really, the only Jean-Claude Van Damme movie that he made for them that's really good is Bloodsport. But man, Bloodsport is a classic. So that's a little primer on Caan films. I hope you check out some of them. They're a lot of fun. And if you like videos like this, make sure to click on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
The year is 1989. The future. Robots are now commonplace, and they're used in everything from manual labor to childcare. But robots go bad, and when they do, the LAPD calls in Sergeant Jack Ramsey, played by Tom Selleck? Yes, that's right, Tom Selleck of Magnum P.I. plays Jack Ramsey, an LAPD expert in so-called runaways, which are droids that go bad in this 1984 thriller, also called Runaway, from director Michael Crichton. Yes, the Michael Crichton, the writer of Jurassic Park. When a madman, played by Gene Simmons, and yes, it's the Gene Simmons, the guy with the tongue from Kiss, invents a microchip that turns all robots into runaways, Ramsey and his new partner, played by Flashdance Cynthia Rhodes, must put a stop to his evil plan. The fate of Los Angeles just might depend on it. Oh yeah, and Tom Selleck's character is terrified of heights. And trust me, that one's very important. So, Michael Crichton as a director. Believe it or not, he actually had a very long, very distinguished career as a director. He also was a writer and also was a medical doctor, but found time to direct a bunch of movies, and you know what? They were actually pretty good. He did Westworld, which is kind of a classic and got turned into an HBO series. He also did a really good movie called Coma, which is based on a novel by another doctor turned writer, Robin Cook, in which Geneviève Bourgeois, who is a Quebecois actress, which is where I'm from, plays a medical doctor investigating an evil doctor, played by Richard Widmark, with a very young Michael Douglas as her boyfriend, who's also a doctor. It's kind of a cool little movie. He also did The Great Train Robbery, which stars Sean Connery and Donald Sutherland, and is a kind of exciting little adventure romp. And then he did a movie called Looker from 1981, which stars Albert Finney as a plastic surgeon who discovers that a company is basically cloning models to turn them into pitch women for their commercials. Kind of strange, but kind of a cool movie too. There's this really cool gun in it that when it gets fired at people, it makes them blank out. I really like that. Anyway, at the time, Tom Selleck was riding high off the success of Magnum P.I., but all was not well with Tom. You see, he was bent on becoming a movie star, and who could blame him? You see, the thing is, Tom Selleck, if you know anything about him, was actually hired to play Indiana Jones in a little movie called Raiders of the Lost Ark. He aced his screen test, which you can find on the DVD and Blu-ray, but the problem is he had filmed the pilot for Magnum P.I. before Raiders of the Lost Ark went into production, so when they were ready to go, he couldn't do it. He had a conflict. Now, I'm sure this was a bitter pill to swallow for Selleck, but it has to be said, Magnum P.I. was one of the most popular TV shows of the 80s, and even if he wasn't Harrison Ford, he still became a household name. But as a TV star. You see, Tom Selleck wanted to be a movie star, so he did a whole slew of movies in 1983 and 1984, some of which are better than others. There's a really cool one that he did called High Road to China, which is kind of an Indiana Jones clone, in which he plays a boozy, alcoholic pilot after World War I. It's a fun little movie, and I like it, and it also has a badass Wilford Brimley. I love me some Wilford Brimley, especially when he's tough. And it has a great score also by James Bond composer John Barry. He then did a movie called Lassiter, which was another quasi-Indiana Jones clone in which he played a sophisticated jewel thief a la Cary Grant who goes up against the Nazis. This movie should have been really good, but there's not enough action in it. It has one really cool action scene where he beats a guy up, like he fights this hulking Nazi, which is kind of a cool scene, but the rest of the movie is kind of dry. But then he decided to make a futuristic action movie called Runaway. Now, as Tom Selleck himself describes it in an AV Club interview, Jack Ramsey is not exactly a character whose name is on the tip of everyone's tongue, but Runaway is a really great popcorn movie that Michael Crichton wrote and directed. It was very futuristic. It had robots and all sorts of stuff, and it was a nice movie. It was a good movie that I'm very proud of, but it didn't do very well, which was a great disappointment to Michael, who became a friend. And Gene Simmons was in it. Gene hadn't been in a feature film before, but he was great. We had some great talks and good times. He played this evil guy named Luther who'd invented bullets that could go around corners and hone in on people. And he had robot spiders that could attack people and inject them with poison. I know it sounds hokey, but with Michael Crichton at the helm, it was pretty good stuff. And indeed, this is pretty good stuff. I have to say, I grew up watching Runaway and I always really liked it. But you see, it came out in the year 1984, where another quasi-futuristic movie about robots came out that, had a bit of an impact. It was called The Terminator. So, Runaway didn't do particularly well. In fact, none of Tom Selleck's movies from those years did very well at the box office. High Road to China, I think, was in the top 30 films for the year, but Runaway was a dismal failure. Did just awful, opening in 7th place at the box office and being beaten by notorious bombs The Cotton Club and Dune. In the end, the film eked out a disastrous $6.7 million at the box office and really ended Tom Selleck's big screen career, although 3 years later, he'd finally have a hit with Three Men and a Baby, which would become the biggest film of 1987, and for a time put him on top of the A-list. Crichton's career as a director took the biggest hit of all, with him only ever helming one more movie, a terrible, terrible Burt Reynolds movie called Physical Evidence in 1989, before turning his attention back to the page so he could write a crazy-sounding book about some dinosaurs in an amusement park. Obviously it didn't emerge to anything, right? So, why is Runaway an entry into the best movie you never saw? So, best movie might be a little too generous for this film, but as a kid growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, Runaway was really a favorite of mine. It's easy to look back at it now and laugh at how ridiculously low-tech the robots are. There's a shot of Selleck's robot nanny making pasta that's especially bad, but this is still kind of a sci-fi actioner. In fact, those of you who might be younger but super into 80s retro stuff like Kung Fury might get a real kick out of this unapologetically silly movie made better by the fact that it tries to be so serious. There are a lot of things to like about Runaway, chief of which is Tom Selleck's completely straight-laced performance. Say what you will about the guy, but he wanted to be a movie star, so he takes Runaway so seriously, barely cracks a smile the entire movie. I mean, this is his shot. He was trying to be Harrison Ford in this movie. And it's funny because he plays this computer expert, but it looks like Tom Selleck is the kind of guy who probably types with his index fingers. I mean, you couldn't have a guy that seems less comfortable around robots than Tom Selleck. And it's funny that his character in the movie went to some night school and suddenly is the head of the LAPD's robot department. I mean, you'd think they would hire an engineer or somebody who knows a thing about computers, but instead he's a beat cop, who had a bad time on assignment one day because of his vertigo, so now he runs the robot department. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it's very strange watching Tom Selleck waltz around a futuristic LA. I think he kind of tried to copy Harrison Ford's career a little too closely, and I'm sure him playing a futuristic LA cop had more than a little to do with Blade Runner. Selleck only really came into his own when he was more laid back and likable, like he was on Magnum P.I. and in his later movies. So it's weird to see him so serious here, but it actually kind of works. He's tall, he looks cool, he's got this cool buzz cut, but his mustache is still flowing. I really like him in this movie. It's also worth noting that in this Me Too era, he's probably amongst the most gentlemanly heroes of the 80s, with him treating his female partner, who's played by Cynthia Rhodes, who seems quite a bit younger than him, with nothing but respect, although they do become an item because she makes all the moves. And I mean, look at him, it's Tom Selleck. I mean, the girl's gonna go crazy, she's only human, come on. And he's also ultra professional with a female suspect he has to search, Kirstie Alley. I mean, he talks about how hot she thinks he is, but he does it very discreetly and behind her back, so it's okay. He never indulges in the kind of casual sexism you might expect given the era and the genre. Of course, I'm not trying to be overly PC here, because these movies are kind of a product of their time, and it doesn't really bother me when I watch a movie and it has kind of a leering hero. It just is what it is. I even like Andrew Dice Clay and Ford Fairlane, so I'm hardly the most PC guy ever, but it's kind of a forward-thinking touch that I was surprisingly impressed with when I rewatched this movie. Likewise, Cynthia Rhodes makes for a very likable heroine/love interest, and it's a shame she essentially retired from films after this. Too bad, because I kind of like Cynthia Rhodes, and I especially like her in Flashdance. What's really famous about this movie, though, is that Gene Simmons plays the bad guy, and he camps it up with this hilariously over-the-top performance as the big bad. He doesn't extend his tongue, but he plays it as like Gene Simmons from Kiss. While the movie was a flop, Gene Simmons actually became pretty much in demand playing bad guys in this movie, following it up with Wanted Dead or Alive, which is a really underrated action flick with Rutger Hauer, and his death scene in the movie where Rutger Hauer tapes a grenade to his face is probably the best bad guy death scene of the 80s. I'm not even kidding. And then he plays a transsexual in Never Too Young to Die, which again, probably not terribly PC, but was recently re-released by Shout Factory and features that iconic 80s action star, John Stamos, and Vanity. I love Vanity. I also enjoyed seeing the great G.W. Bailey, famous for all the Police Academy movies, turn up as the angry police chief. And oh yes, he's a police chief, and he's angry. He made a very good career out of playing grumpy authority figures in this era, second only to James Tolkien. Also, the film has Kirstie Alley before she went on to do Cheers, and there's a film score by Jerry Goldsmith that is just completely insane because it's totally electronic. It's so dated and it's crazy synthy, but I really like it. Now, the thing that people remember about Runaway, if they remember it at all, is the great MacGuffin, which is that Simmons' baddie invents a heat-seeking bullet that can chase its victims. And in this movie, it chases Tom Selleck around with these great POV shots, which are incredible. They probably ate up the budget, but the animation for the bullets is really kind of spectacular for a movie from 1984. And in fact, the bullet's eye point of view was copied in a famous Hong Kong action movie called Full Contact starring Chow Yun-fat. It's really cool, but the issue is the logic doesn't make sense because when anybody else gets shot by one of these bullets, it's completely impossible for them to escape. But Tom Selleck is actually able to outrun the bullets more than once in this movie. I really like these heat-seeking bullets, and I also like the part where he has to disarm a bullet that gets wedged into Cynthia Rhodes' arm. It's a pretty cool little scene and actually quite tense. And the action at the end is pretty good when he fights Gene Simmons in this construction high-rise where he has to overcome his fear of heights in order to save his son. He gets sprayed in the face with acid twice, so he looks like hell by the time the movie's over. But what's really weird is he's got like a face full of acid, but then he starts like Frenching Cynthia Rhodes in like a love scene kind of kiss that goes on pretty much through the entire end credits. It's really weird, and you think, maybe he would have washed his face first, but I mean, it's Tom Selleck, and she makes the move because, I mean, look at him. It's Tom Selleck. I mean, this guy is prime. So Runaway is a silly slice of 80s cheese, but I enjoyed watching it many times over the years, and I always have a good time with this movie, especially with the right inspiration, if I do say so myself. It's a pretty nostalgic flick for me and a guaranteed good time for anyone interested in this era. Also, Tom Selleck as a leading man. Let's do a little lightning round. High Road to China is probably the most legit of his leading man movies from the early era. Bess Armstrong is his co-star, Wilford Brimley, as I mentioned, is in it, has a great score by John Barry and some really good aviation scenes. It's by the guy who directed a great Clint Eastwood movie called Where Eagles Dare, so I would give this one a watch. Lassiter, as I said, has that one really good fight scene and some tastefully done nudity from Jane Seymour, which I cannot object to, but is kind of dated. Runaway, of course, is badass. 3 Men and a Baby. Everybody loves 3 Men and a Baby. I hate 3 Men and a Little Lady. I mean, that movie just isn't good at all. The best Tom Selleck movie, I think, is probably Quigley Down Under, which is this cool western with Alan Rickman as the bad guy. But alas, none of his movies really caught fire, except for 3 Men and a Baby. And oh yeah, there's one more really good Tom Selleck movie. It's called An Innocent Man, where he plays, what else? An innocent man who gets sent to jail for drugs and gets out a couple years later and goes for revenge against the crooked cops who framed him. One of them is actually Sledgehammer. If you know the 80s, you'll know who Sledgehammer is. So Runaway, as I said, a lot of fun, and I hope people check it out. And if you like this kind of content, and you like the best movie you never saw, make sure to click on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.